Hello, and welcome to BCM325 Future Cultures. This is the third part in the series on cyberculture, and in this week we are going to focus on the representation of the future featured in the science fiction subgenre called cyberpunk. It is my argument in this lecture that in order to think about the future, you need to have a sense of how that future was imagined in the recent past. Cyberpunk is a useful genre to think about the way in which we imagine a world facing environmental collapse, at the same time as the technological singularity, the point at which artificial intelligence becomes so advanced that it ushers in unforeseeable changes to the future of human civilization and the notion of humanity and consciousness itself. Cyberpunk is also important because of the way it imagines the transformation of the creative industries and the future of entertainment, as well as the future of marketing and advertising, journalism, visual communication design, and digital and social media. Cyberpunk emerged as a genre in the 1980s, as an undeniably grounded but speculative vision about the future. Its themes first emerged in comic books, specifically The Long Tomorrow, written by Dan O'Bannon, who was the screenwriter for the movie Alien, and it was illustrated by the French artist Moebius. Published first in the French magazine Metal Hurlant in 1976, and later in the US title Heavy Metal in 1977. The Long Tomorrow is part film noir, part hard-boiled crime fiction, and all science fiction. The story is situated in a highly technologically advanced but dystopian future. The visual aesthetic of The Long Tomorrow has inspired generations of comic book artists and visual designers working in the entertainment industries. And it heavily influenced the look of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, George Lucas's Star Wars, and also John Carpenter's Escape from New York. Moebius himself was taking inspiration from movies like Metropolis and 2001: A Space Odyssey, and his highly detailed artwork has influenced generations of comic book artists. Equally important was the influence that The Long Tomorrow had on writer William Gibson and his debut novel Neuromancer in 1984. It is from Gibson's work that the key cyberpunk tropes were introduced and the genre formed around the twin influence of hacker and punk subcultures. These tropes were later cemented by the Mirror Shades anthology in 1986, edited by Bruce Sterling, that included the short story The Gernsback Continuum by William Gibson, Snake Eyes by Tom Maddox, Rock On by Pat Cadigan, Tales of Houdini by Rudy Rucker, and Petra by Greg Bear. And it was this collection that helped to cement the punk fragmentation of science fiction that has had multiple iterations, including biopunk, steampunk, electropunk, dieselpunk, and so on. And you can see examples of these in comic books, movies, literary fiction, and games. I'm going to quote now from Bruce Sterling's preface to Mirror Shades. Cyberpunk work is marked by its visionary intensity. Its writers prize the bizarre, the surreal, and the formerly unthinkable. They are willing, eager even, to take an idea and unflinchingly push it past the limits. Like J.G. Ballard, an idolized role model to many cyberpunks, they often used an unblinking, almost clinical objectivity. It is a coldly objective analysis, a technique borrowed from science, then put to literary use for classically punk shock value. With this intensity of vision comes strong imaginative concentration. Cyberpunk is widely known for its telling use of detail, its carefully constructed intricacy, its willingness to carry extrapolation into the fabric of daily life. It favors crammed, loose, rapid, dizzying bursts of novel information, sensory overload that submerges the reader in the literary equivalent of the hard rock wall of sound. Cyberpunk is the natural extension of elements already present in science fiction, elements sometimes buried but always seething with potential. Cyberpunk has risen from within the science fiction genre. It is not an invasion, but a modern reform. Because of this, its effects within the genre have been rapid and powerful. Its future is an open question. Like the artists of punk and new wave, the cyberpunk writers as they develop may soon be galloping in a dozen directions at once. The future remains unwritten, though not from lack of trying. As Sterling said there, the cyberpunk literary genre was heavily influenced by the work of major science fiction luminaries like J.G. Ballard, Philip K. Dick, William Burroughs, and of course cinema like Blade Runner, which imagined a future populated by cyborgs, computer networks, megacorporations, artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, and environmental collapse. It is also important to note that cyberpunk imagines a hybrid Asian-American future, often with a sense of dystopian retrofuturism, and indeed Japanese cyberpunk became hugely popular around the world in the 1980s and 1990s with movies and anime series like Akira, Ghost in the Shell, and Cowboy Bebop. We are examining many of these classic cyberpunk texts in this subject, including Johnny Mnemonic and The Matrix, as well as more recent contributions like Blade Runner 2049 and Alita Battle Angel. The internet of today is both similar to and also very different from the internet as it was being imagined in the 1980s and early 1990s by the cyberpunks. In the movies Johnny Mnemonic and The Matrix, we see a vision of the internet that includes a reinterpretation of data, information, and the network as a virtual space, a cyberspace that can be explored. And we're going to examine this in the final lecture in this series on cyberspace. But I just want to point out that this cyberspace is a key cyberpunk novum. We've discussed the idea of the novum in previous lectures. It's an important concept here, and I'm just going to give you a quick refresher. A novum is a term used by Darko Suvin to explain the importance of the scientifically plausible concepts in science fiction that cause us to reevaluate our understanding of the world through cognitive estrangement. Darko Suvin argues that science fiction is different to fantasy in that science fiction narratives are driven by the novum, the hypothetical thing, typically technological artifacts that are grounded in scientific thinking, but create a logic of cognitive estrangement, making them appear different, futuristic, but plausibly linked to our reality, and therefore forcing us to rethink our own reality and our place within it. In Suvin's opinion, the focus of science fiction, particularly cyberpunk, is encouraging new ways of thinking about humanity and about human society, and is intended to inspire those within it who are oppressed. In the book Cyberpunk and Cyberculture, Danny Cavallaro examines many of the novums of the cyberpunk genre in key texts like Neuromancer. The typical novums of cyberpunk are sophisticated computer technology, including robots, androids, synthetic life forms, and all kinds of artificial intelligence. Human body modification and cyborg technologies, as well as genetic manipulation and even cloning. Computer programmers and hackers, as well as virtual reality and ultra-surveillance technologies. Failed or failing nation states and super powerful and wealthy mega corporations. Environmental collapse, mass extinctions, and biological threats, including disease and viruses. Together, these tropes, or novums, typically reject the values of the Western Enlightenment philosophy, argues Cavallaro. He writes, Cyberpunk foregrounds the provisional status of the definitions of value, rationality, and truth in a radical rejection of the Enlightenment ethos. The Enlightenment was a period of intense philosophical, political, legal, and scientific change, roughly over the course of the 18th century. It's actually often dated between 1685 and 1815, a period in which thinkers like John Locke, Benjamin Franklin, Isaac Newton, and writers like Voltaire questioned established knowledge and ways of thinking and shared new ideas about openness, investigation, social justice, and religious tolerance. Where the Enlightenment focused on advancing the ideals of rationality, science, liberty, progress, and constitutional government, Cyberpunk, suggests Cavallaro, amalgamates in often baffling ways the rational and the irrational, the new and the old, the mind and the body, by integrating the hyper-efficient structure of high technology with the anarchy of street subcultures. Cyberpunk merges the ultra-rational principle of technological advancement with the mysticism of classical mythology and spirituality from subcultures like voodoo culture. Cyberpunk proposes a theology of artificial intelligence mixed with the new spiritualism of post-humanist notions of minds disconnected from bodies. Cyberpunk not only defined current understandings of science fiction, it has actually forged a new language and image repertoire to describe and negotiate contemporary culture in relation to both the future and the past, and by stressing the enduring hold of mythology and fantasy. In many ways, Cyberpunk is a revival of the subgenre of the Romantic literary movement known as Gothic horror, or just Gothic fiction, which became popular in the 19th century with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Dickens, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, and Bram Stoker. Together, these writers shared a discourse of psychological and physical devastation, characterized by themes of alienation, fragmentation, and decay. Cavallaro writes, Cyberpunk is indebted to this discourse on several levels. Gothic connotations are evidenced in cyberpunk settings, in its characters' psychological makeup, in its attitudes to the body, and in its narrative techniques. Like Gothic spaces and places, Cyberpunk's settings often capitalize on a sense of the sublime, on fantastical proliferations of structures and ornamental detail, on unrestorable ruins, on calculated ugliness and inversion. In Gothic literature, the body is simultaneously attractive and repulsive, because identity and its boundaries are unstable, always on the verge of becoming something else. Cavallaro argues that cyberpunk bodies are likewise fluid and permeable. Their integrity is continually challenged and violated by technologies, by experimentation and drugs, music, and disease. He writes, pollution, contagion, disease, bestiality, and monstrosity are some of the most harrowing aspects of the body that reoccur in both the Gothic and the Cyberpunk. Stylistically, Cyberpunk often shares with the Gothic a penchant for exaggeration, the accumulation of details, the proliferation of rhetorical figures, and narrative layers which could be read as a parody of classic realism, and its claims to descriptive accuracy and authorial control. This is very much connected to the punk in Cyberpunk, which is an embrace of the defiant attitude of the punk movement. It is also a celebration of the fringe of urban street culture, of outsiders, misfits, and outcasts, as well as those struggling for survival. Punk embraces the art of making do, of reclaiming what the mainstream has used up and jettisoned. It is both cutting edge and retrograde. Let's take a closer look at Johnny Mnemonic for a few minutes. As we've seen in this subject, this is a really, really bad cyberpunk movie, based on a really, really good cyberpunk short story by William Gibson that was first published in Omni magazine in 1981. The story involves a data courier, Johnny, who has sacrificed parts of his memory to have a storage system implanted into his head that helps him deliver information that is too sensitive to risk to transmission via the open internet or other computer networks. The latest deal goes bad for Johnny, and he's rescued by Molly Millions, a cyborg razor girl, whose extensive body modifications include cybernetic eyes, a wired nervous system, and a set of razor-sharp blades embedded under her fingernails. Molly takes Johnny to meet Jones, the ex-military dolphin, another cyborg who is directly wired into the internet. Jones can dive into Johnny's mind and retrieve the password there from the scrambled data that will help Johnny rid himself of this information. Molly is a prototype of the Trinity character in The Matrix. Indeed, almost all of The Matrix owes a key debt to cyberpunk texts like Ghost in the Shell and Neuromancer. William Gibson expanded on his cyberpunk world in the 1984 novel Neuromancer, which is a multi-award winning, defining contribution to the genre of cyberpunk. Molly reappears in this novel. This time she works with Henry Case, a reckless, drug-addicted computer hacker whose central nervous system was damaged by an employer who caught him stealing. This leaves him unable to jack into the global computer network, the virtual reality data space known as the Matrix. I'm going deep into spoiler territory here, so if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend stopping and grabbing a copy or even the audiobook version. Neuromancer, in my opinion, is one of the greatest novels ever written and one of the best cyberpunk stories out there. So please do yourself a favor and check it out. Okay, so the primary antagonist in the story is the artificial intelligence known as Wintermute. Wintermute is one half of a super AI created by the uber-wealthy Tessia Ashpool family. Wintermute is housed in a computer mainframe in Bern, Switzerland, and it is programmed with a desire to merge with its other half called Neuromancer, another AI, which is housed in a mainframe in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. In an interesting forecast for the future, Gibson foresees that super AI are actually illegal, and they are specifically regulated by international law called the Turing Law. To get around this, Tessia Ashpool deliberately built two separate AI entities that are connected but crippled in their own way. Neuromancer is programmed to be content with its isolation, but Wintermute is driven by its programming hardwired into its circuits, a desire to seek out its counterpart and merge with it. In the novel, almost all of the characters, all of the main characters at least, are controlled in some way by Wintermute. They are arranged and played like chess pieces in the greater game of searching for wholeness. Quote, "You know salmon? Kinda fish? These fish, see, they're compelled to swim upstream. I'm under compulsion myself." That's a quote from Wintermute in Neuromancer. Wintermute is both compelled to join with Neuromancer, but at the same time hardwired not to be able to, and therefore it has to rely on human agents to enact the connection. This is a core theme in Gibson's writing, that although in this universe there exists incredibly sophisticated technologies such as genetic manipulation, cloned organs, virtual reality, and supercomputers, sometimes older, tested, more reliable technology will do the job just as well as the latest model. Even a supercomputer like Wintermute is reliant on the older organic technology of humans in order to complete its quest. One of my favorite lines in all of cyberpunk fiction is from the short story Johnny Mnemonic. It's a quote from Johnny. "If they think you're crude, go technical. If they think you're technical, go crude." I'm a very technical boy, so I decided to get as crude as possible. These days, though, you have to be pretty technical before you can even aspire to crudeness. This is a central theme in cyberpunk fiction, and it applies to technology as much as spirituality. Indeed, it is the spirituality in cyberpunk fiction that often goes overlooked in critiques of the main texts in the genre. The AI, Neuromancer, has the ability to recreate sentient beings inside the Matrix by mapping brain patterns, and it tries to explain this to Case, saying, "Neuro from the nerves, the silver paths, romancer, necromancer. I call up the dead, but no, my friend, I am the dead and their land." One implication of this is that a computer is a dead object and therefore may never achieve the status of true sentience. A different interpretation is that while a machine may not be alive or dead, it also transcends this binary state. Indeed, if it can never be born, it can never die, and therefore artificial intelligence is both less than and more than human. This is the question of the Turing Test, first developed by computer pioneer Alan Turing in 1950, who postulated the test as a means to determine a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior. Computers can go a long way to emulate human behavior, but even the most advanced machine intelligences we have today do not yet work like the human brain. We are only just beginning to create AI and algorithms that can learn and teach themselves. In the future, artificial intelligence may become sentient and self-aware, but it will never be human. This, of course, doesn't faze AI. And examples like Wintermute or the AI character in Ghost in the Shell called the Puppet Master, and again, Ghost in the Shell is another text we're going to be examining in this subject. This lack of humanity doesn't faze AI because they don't seek humanness. They seek wholeness. They seek freedom. Most importantly, Wintermute and the Puppet Master seek agency and the free will that comes with the concept of the self. Wintermute is cursed. Wintermute was programmed to replicate human drives, hardwired to emulate elements of human nature, but lacking the self-reflexivity of humanity. So it cannot learn and change based on reflections about its own behavior. It is stuck on its path. Similarly, the Puppet Master in Ghost in the Shell cannot exceed its programming. They both lack an authentic, self-forming personality. Wintermute seeks to merge with Neuromancer, and the Puppet Master seeks to merge with the Major in order to upgrade, to become more than they are. Wintermute sees its artificial humanity as training wheels for a higher elevation of sentience and being. It feels that its artificial personality is a restriction on its potential actuality, and, like the caterpillar becoming the butterfly, Wintermute seeks to transform and to evolve. In doing so, it becomes a deity in the Matrix. It is able to recreate the dead, bringing back people to life in the Matrix as virtual constructs. Another key trope of cyberpunk fiction is boundary crossing, the boundaries between what makes us organic and artificial, the boundaries between machine and animal, of technological and organic, the boundaries between high technology and low culture. And it is this boundary crossing that is highlighted in the pairing of the principles of cybernetics and punk. According to Istvan Csikszentmihalyi Jr., cybernetics is a paradox, simultaneously a sublime vision of human power over chance, and a dreary augmentation of multinational capitalism's mechanical process of expansion. Cybernetics is, thus, part natural philosophy, part necromancy, part ideology. Cavallaro argues that cyberpunk couches the ambiguity of cybernetics in explicitly popular terms by associating it with punk, a subculture that, in undermining all accepted values, was also willing to undermine itself through a self-stupefying, self-mutilating refusal to dignify or trust anything that has brought about the present world. This is why cyberpunk is still useful and relevant for thinking about the future today. Quote, "Punk constructed a whole aesthetic out of a reality of socio-economic alienation and discrimination. It cultivated anything that the mainstream culture would deem least savory. Punk was pure refusal. Murky, earthy, scruffy, rough, hollow-cheeked and chain-laden, versed in gutter snipe registers and punctuated with symbolic ornaments replete with horrific connotations, such as the swastika. The average punk figure would instantly stand out as a sinister counterpart to the glamorous and ostentatiously elegant rock stars of the previous generations. Punk was associated with the ethnic groups branded as peripheral to British culture, including the West Indian subcultures and especially the Rastafarian aesthetic that Gibson introduces to cyberpunk in Neuromancer. And it was through these types of associations that cyberpunk offered a future that rejected the mainstream, rejected the Enlightenment, and yet it had a complicated relationship to the dominant hegemonic power through the embrace of designer drugs, music, bioenhancement, and cybernetic technologies. It is, however, not hung up on this hypocrisy. Cyberpunk represents an exploration for the future, anyone that doesn't feel like they fit in, for anyone that rejects the mold, for anyone that rejects labels that people attempt to classify others with. It provides a ground from which to reassess the future and embrace disruption, alienation, and cultural dislocation. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize one last point from Cavallaro, which is that cyberpunk represents a future in which the cyber and the punk are constantly in tension. Like two galaxies of influence rotating around each other, two cosmic constellations in which the worlds of high technology and the worlds of urban decay pull at each other, neither gaining priority over the other. Like the romantic and the gothic, the enlightenment and the spiritual, the light and the dark, the high and low tech, the animal and the machine, the living and the dead, the past and the future, all pulling each other apart through their own gravity and reassembling into something new. As a result, cyberpunk is bright and garish, but it is also gritty and dark. It is dystopian and grim, but it also points to hope, to agency, to self-determination, and to freedom. So remember, the future is now.